In this video, we're going to go over the top 10 perishable preps for your emergency food storage. Let's get started. In the world of emergency preparedness, the top food preps to get are the ones that are shelf stable and non-perishable. So things like rice and beans and canned foods. When stored properly, these items could last for several years on your shelf without refrigeration. If you put things like rice in Mylar bags and 5-gallon buckets and remove the oxygen, they could last for many decades. But for this video, we're going to discuss what are the top perishable preps to include in your emergency food storage. Let's say that you're planning on bunkering in place for 1 to 2 months just to lay low, and you already have a decent amount of non-perishable food items. What are those last-minute perishable preps that may require refrigeration that you would want to get before bunkering in place for 1 to 2 months? Maybe you want to go on a last-minute Costco run, for example. So I'm going to list off what I think are the top perishable preps to purchase in that kind of situation, and we're going to discuss how long they would last in room temperature, how long they would last in the refrigerator, and how long they would last in the freezer. Now, I don't think anyone should panic buy or anything like that. And when I go to the grocery store, I just try to have my shopping cart look fairly normal in terms of how many items are in it. However, I may go to 2 to 3 grocery stores to top off my food preps. So let's get started with the list now. This list is in no particular order. Starting off first, we have milk. We use milk often in our family for all sorts of things, whether that be for cold cereal, carnation instant breakfast, or for cooking. I prefer going with cartons of milk over the jugs of milk. Although the jugs are kind of cool because they let you know when the milk has gone bad by that little dimple that's on the end of the milk jug. Milk only lasts around 4 hours at room temperature. If you store milk in the refrigerator, it'll last 5 to 7 days after the sell date. I find that the cartons usually have a longer sell date than the jugs do. And by the way, don't store milk in the door of the refrigerator. You want to store it in the main body of the fridge where it's colder. And you could store milk in your freezer for 3 to 4 months. Again, at number 1, we have milk. And number 2, I have cheese. And no, you don't want to cut the cheese. I prefer going with block cheese. So rather than getting the pre-shredded cheese, for example, which doesn't last as long, go with the block cheese. I find that it has a pretty nice shelf life when stored in the refrigerator. Of course, cheese doesn't last that long when stored out of the refrigerator. Similar to milk, around 4 hours. But you could store a block of cheddar cheese, for example, in the refrigerator for around 6 months. You don't get that much improvement when storing it in the freezer, where cheese will last 6 to 8 months. Harder blocks of cheese, like Parmesan, for example, could last even longer. At number 3, I have bread. Now, while it's important for preppers to know how to make their own bread, I like to have some pre-sliced bread ready to go. At room temperature, bread can last around 5 to 7 days. Although I found that the sliced bread that we get seems to last a lot longer than that. It's not really recommended to store bread in the refrigerator, but you can store it in the freezer for around 3 months. Make sure that you wrap it in aluminum foil or a freezer bag. So what we like doing is buying several loaves of bread, wrapping them up in aluminum foil, and then putting them in the freezer for long-term storage. This won't last a year, but it'll definitely last longer than what it would at room temperature. At number 4, I have potatoes. If there's one thing that I learned from the movie The Martian featuring Matt Damon, it's that you want to have potatoes in your emergency food storage. He survived on Mars by only eating potatoes for that entire time. Now you should definitely try growing your own potatoes in a container garden, which is what we do. But if I had to bunker in place for a little bit, I would probably get a large bag of potatoes that you could get over at a restaurant supply store. Potatoes last around 1 to 2 weeks when on the counter, but they'll last 3 to 4 months in ideal storage conditions. And what that means is just in a dark area that's colder than room temperature. It usually works best if you store them in a paper bag where they get some air, but it's still dark and cold. Potatoes don't last nearly as long when stored in the refrigerator, lasting only 3 to 4 weeks. So it's not really recommended to store potatoes in the refrigerator because it gives it a sweet taste and darkens the color. Raw potatoes don't store well in the freezer, but if you cook them before freezing, they do last 10 to 12 months. So again, if you want to store some potatoes in your freezer, make sure that you cook them first, and you'll get around a year of storage with them. At number 5, I have onions. Again, go with a large bag of onions, like something that you could get at a restaurant supply store. I think that you could cook a lot of items with potatoes and onions, so that's why I prioritize them. Onions could last around 2 to 3 months, similar to potatoes when stored properly. Again, store them in a cool, dark place. And it's best to store them in a loosely covered bag or mesh bag to allow for air circulation. You don't get much extension in the shelf life when you store them in the refrigerator. Again, they last around 2 to 3 months. And if you put them in the freezer, they last around 6 to 8 months. However, cooked onions can last 10 to 12 months when stored in the freezer. So if you want to have some onions on hand, make sure that you cook them first, put them in a freezer bag, and you could store them in your freezer for up to a year. At number 6, we have eggs. Our family eats a lot of eggs, so we like having it on hand at all times. Eggs don't last that long when stored at room temperature at only around 2 hours. Eggs can last 4 to 5 weeks when stored in the refrigerator. They maintain their best quality until 3 weeks after their sell date. Again, with eggs, you want to make sure that you store them in the main body of the refrigerator where it's colder. You can store eggs in your freezer, where they'll last 10 to 12 months when they're not in the shells. So again, remove the shell if you're planning on storing eggs in the freezer. And if you do that, you could get around a year of shelf life. If you happen to have your own chickens, you don't have to worry about eggs. But for those that don't, you'll have to have your own eggs stored. At number 7, I have butter. We use butter all the time for cooking. Butter can last around 1 to 2 days at room temperature, although my grandparents used to store butter for many days at room temperature. Butter can last around 1 month after the sell date when stored in the refrigerator. You'll want to make sure that you keep that butter wrapped in an airtight container or a wrap when refrigerated. You can store butter in the freezer, which lasts 6 to 12 months for best quality. Salted butter will maintain best quality in the freezer for around 12 months, while unsalted will stay at peak quality for about 6 months. You could still use it beyond that time, but that's just for best quality. So again, at number 7, pick up some salted butter and store it in the freezer. You'll get around a year of storage out of it. At number 8, I have whole chicken. We get a lot of uses out of a whole chicken, mainly to make soups. Raw chicken will only last around 2 hours when at room temperature. It'll last a few days when stored in the refrigerator, but one whole chicken can last around 1 year when stored in the freezer. So that's what we do. What we like doing is making a large batch of chicken soup using one whole chicken. That'll last our family for multiple days. Now you could always can chicken by using a pressurized canner to have them shelf stable. We've been doing that a lot over the past year and a half, but that's mainly for diced chicken. I still think it's good to have whole chickens on hand for cooking purposes. If you have your own chickens at home and you have meat chickens that have no names, you could always eat them. We currently don't, so we have to stock up on our whole chickens in the freezer. At number 9, I have beef. And I know the last few items aren't really vegan friendly, but don't worry, we only eat vegan animals. Ground beef lasts around 2 hours at room temperature, a few days when stored in the refrigerator, but it can last around 3 to 4 months at best quality when stored in the freezer. Again, I like pressure canning my ground beef, and we've been doing that a lot over the past year and a half. However, I think that the frozen ground beef tastes better than canned ground beef, which has a slightly different texture. It would probably be better to store something like a large roast in the freezer rather than ground beef, because that would last longer. You can make a large meal that would last your family multiple days, if you were bunkering in place and trying to ration things. But again, I have beef. It's what's for dinner. And the number 10 perishable item that I included in my list is in honor of Clara from Great Depression Cooking, and that is hot dogs. I've already included potatoes and onions in this list, so if I include hot dogs, that allows me to make Clara's poor man's meal. A few months back, I did a live stream with Clara's grandson, Christopher, who produced all of the videos from Great Depression Cooking, featuring Clara. The poor man's meal was a big hit during the Great Depression and also with Christopher and his family and friends when they were growing up. Hot dogs last around 2 hours at room temperature, around 7 days when stored in the refrigerator, and 1 to 2 months when stored in the freezer. And that's just for best quality. They'll remain safe beyond that time. Cooked hot dogs will last 4 months in the freezer. So if you want to include hot dogs in your perishable preps and you're planning on bunkering in place for a couple months, it might be a good idea to cook up all those hot dogs and then store them in the freezer using freezer bags. You'll be able to make Clara's poor man's meal whenever you want by including some diced potatoes, diced onions, and sliced hot dogs. With seasoning, of course. That's going to do it for this video featuring the top 10 perishable foods to include in your food storage if you're planning on bunkering in place for a couple months. Again, the best thing to do is have non-perishable food items. So rice and beans and wheat and oats, store them in Mylar bags and they'll last for many, many years. It's also a good idea to start canning your own food, especially if you eat meat. So pressure canning chicken and ground beef and pork and other items that you want to have shelf stable. But I think it's a good idea to try to keep your diet normal during an emergency situation if at all possible, especially if you have kids. You probably don't want to switch your kids over during an emergency situation to some strange diet. So I think it's a good idea to try to keep things normal for as long as possible, if you're going to be bunkering in place for a little bit. Of course, the main downfall with a lot of the items that were included in this video is that they do require refrigeration to last that long. If there's one thing that we've seen over the past few years during the pandemic is that we all had internet, we all had power, yet we are still in an unknown emergency situation. It's always good to have backup power sources like generators or solar panels. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video featuring the top 10 perishable preps. Please leave your comments below in the comments section regarding this video and let me know what you think are the top 10 perishable preps that you would include in your food storage if you had to bunker in place for a short period of time. I've included a PDF document that you could download by clicking the link in the description box below. It has a list of everything that was mentioned in this video, including the shelf life and the storage life when stored in the refrigerator, the freezer, and at room temperature. Stay tuned for more emergency preparedness videos, and I'll see you next time. Take care.